Hello and welcome everyone to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. As you may know, if you've been listening in, we have a primary election coming up in August. And so regular contributor Emily Kornheiser and I are trying to talk to as many candidates as we can between now and August. And today we're talking with former representative from Woodstock, Charlie Kimball, who is running for Lieutenant Governor. Welcome, Charlie.
Thank you. And current representative. Yes.
Current rep. Now, wait a minute. I'm a little confused because I thought you had to step down from one position to run for another.
No, you can even run for 5 at a time.
Yeah, it's an odd quirk in Vermont that you can run for multiple offices, but I'm not seeking off re-election in my current position as representative. But until January, until the new representative is sworn in, then I am representative. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you for that clarification. For some reason, I thought you had to leave one position before you could campaign.
No, and fun election fact, I think Chris Winters is still serving as Deputy Secretary of State while he campaigns as for Secretary of State.
Ah, okay.
Ooh.
Yeah.
That's an interesting one.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And just want to let listeners know before we dive into the conversation that early voting starts on Friday. Wow. Vermont has a very large and beautiful early election window. And so anytime between Friday and August 9th, folks can either sign up to get an absentee ballot on the Secretary of State's website. They can call their town clerk. They can go to their town clerk, fill out a ballot, turn it in anytime between now and August 9th. And then on August 9th, you can go vote in the regular real life with the machine.
Thank you. Yeah, most people, the state has been sending out postcards. So you may have actually seen that come in your mailbox. So Charlie, let's start with just the broad question I'm asking all candidates who come on the show. There are so many ways to serve your community. Mm-hmm. There's volunteering, there's, being on the select board, there's being on a school board, working at the library, so many different ways. Why is running for either rep or, serving as rep and then now running for lieutenant governor, why have you chosen this path as your path for public service?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I mean, I've been involved with community service for a long time, starting as a volunteer, even in 6th grade, as helping coach the other kids in skiing, teaching kids how to ski on a home hill at Hardack on a rope tow in St. Albans. But since then, I've been involved with the community, serving on boards, serving on the board of trustees of the St. Albans Public Library, and the village trustees in Woodstock when we moved here, on several different Rotary clubs, service organizations, the treasurer of countless organizations, Pentangle Council on the Arts, Good Neighbor Health Clinic. I'm not the treasurer on that board, King Street Youth Center. So I've served in a variety of ways already. And then when I ran for the legislature 6 years ago, it was an opening, it was an opportunity to really represent my community and do more work for the community in the state legislature. And I have to say that's been really rewarding in the sense of being able to help constituents navigate state government. And sometimes it can be very confusing for citizens to figure out, who do I contact about this? Or can you help me do that? And that's been very rewarding. I've enjoyed that part of the work. And the reason why I'm running for lieutenant governor is it's an extension of what I've been doing in the legislature. And that is to really focus on economic development, but also workforce development. And for me, that's been the key, is on looking to how to make it available so everyone who's willing to apply themselves and maybe gain new skills can find a meaningful career in Vermont. And that's something that really falls between different agencies. It falls between different committees in the legislature. There's not really a great coordination among them, even though there are efforts to try. We have some excellent programs in Vermont. We have some excellent agencies. But what often happens is that people fall through the cracks. in terms of kids coming out of high school, people that come back from college without a degree, with debt, and they're trying to figure out, what do I do now? Or people trying to reorient themselves as to where they want to go. And that is about workforce development and training. And that's where my focus has been in the legislature. Just completed another major bill on that this year. And then looking at, anytime I talk to anybody about workforce, it all comes back to housing. Where are they going to live? I can't afford to live here. Employers are talking about, I would love to hire more workers, but they can't find any place to live. And we know that the affordability crisis is very much alive and well in Vermont in terms of housing and childcare, the everyday cost of life. So those are the things that have compelled me to try to do that work on a state level. And while it's in the House, where I've served for 6 years, you get to focus on one particular policy area, and you get to know that area really well. And the issue of workforce development is across a lot of committees, whether it's education, healthcare, workforce development, and economic development, and general military affairs. So it's all these different committees. And I look at this as an opportunity to really be able to focus on that and try to make an improvement there. So that's why I'm running.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Charlie. We had talked about when we were scheduling this show about different policies. And one area you have focused on is rural economies.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would agree that our rural economies are important in Vermont, and we need to support them and revitalize them in many cases. But not everyone would, I think, agree on how that should be done or what that would look like. So for you, what are some of the steps that need to be taken to support our rural economies?
Yeah, if you think about it, and when we got the new census, there was great anticipation that we would find that all of Vermont had a decline in population, which was actually not true. So we had a 2.8% in our overall, 2.8% increase in our overall population. But we did have 3 counties in Vermont have a decline in population from 2010 to 2020. And we've had a lot of towns within those more rural areas have a decline in population. And that's one measure as to whether or not those communities are vital or vibrant. So if you think about community and economic vitality in rural towns, that's something that a group of us in the legislature, we call ourselves the Rural Economic Development Working Group, or Red Wing. It's easier to say Rural Caucus, but so we've been focusing on what is it that we can do to help grow and sustain the economies in rural Vermont. And part of it is looking at those industries that are operating in rural Vermont. Things such as the forest products industry, things such as diversified agriculture, outdoor recreation, that you can find and thrive in rural Vermont. But then we also talk about poverty. And the further you get from a population center, the greater poverty you encounter. And that is because there aren't the same kind of job opportunities, but there aren't necessarily the skill sets among the folks that are working or living in rural Vermont. So I think it's a few things. One is to make sure that the people in rural parts of the state have access to the kind of skill training and education that they need in order to qualify for a better paying job. The second is we come back to the issue of broadband, and it's an easy answer to a question that's very difficult to solve, saying, well, let's just connect everybody. And we've allocated a lot of money in the legislature to be able to bring fiber to the home or the business. And I think in 3 to 4 years, we're going to see incredible connectivity because of the work that we've done. There's a lot being done in the communication union districts. So those are some of the things. But we also have to think about the vitality of that general store. And in a lot of communities, they struggle to stay open because we've had a systemic change in how people buy and how people communicate, and how they socialize, how they get educated, how they get their medicine. So all those things have really changed the fabric of our community and especially in rural Vermont. So even our school system, and I'm sure Representative Kornheiser can talk to that, is studying the details of how we fund our schools and what schools are still open. So
before we jump into schools, I want to sort of go deeper on one thing you said. So when you first started talking, I wanted to interrupt and say, like, okay, can we even define rural here? So, yeah. By any measure, outside of the state of Vermont, pretty much anything except for downtown Burlington is considered rural, right? And then sort of there's other definitions of rural that would include, say, the suburbs. In most universes, Brattleboro is considered, even downtown Brattleboro is considered rural. However, downtown Bellows Falls is not, because it is denser than Brattleboro. It's very strange. Yeah. But I think there's the lived experience of people when they think of rural, and then there's what sort of population density means. And then there's this idea that sort of rural is a place with less opportunity, which would definitely encompass pretty much everything outside of Chittenden County. And then as we sort of go from there, you laid out this economic argument that people are sort of the way for people to access better wage jobs is to get more training. We can talk about that more later. Certainly disagree with you on that, but you know that already. Yes. I think but what I'm curious about to dive into is, we started this conversation with the question of vitality. Mm-hmm. And vitality isn't just about the economy. It's about how people gather and communicate and all of those things, right? It's about how we come together, how we govern, how we play, how we meet our neighbors, how we do all of those things. And I think in that case, by any national measure, our rural communities are more vital than most other places in the whole country. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of sort of slippage there, and I know that you've done this diner tour, which is adorable. And I just saw in Vermont Digger that one of the diners in your neck of the woods is actually closing. Mm-hmm. And so, I remember when I first moved to Vermont 20 something years ago. I'm really just going on this path. When I moved to Vermont more than 20 years ago, the phenomenon of the older men sort of gathering at the gas station for coffee, or gathering at the coffee shop for coffee, but often it was sort of a gas station, coffee shop, general store thing.
The coffee clutches in the morning.
Yes. Yeah. It was totally fascinating to me. Not something that I saw growing up. And also sort of this delightful intergenerational opportunity as these older men are sort of watching over everyone. But, it's not just that we don't have places to gather and we don't have people who want to do that kind of gathering anymore. Even I don't think the business model of the general store is one thing. And I think that's quite solvable. And I think a lot of communities are solving that. And I think that would be interesting to talk about. But there's sort of the other piece of it, which is, do people actually want to do that kind of gathering? Do people want to do a different kind of gathering? Are we creating governance and social opportunities for Vermonters that might want things to be different? Or is it just that everyone's commuting so far they don't have time to go have coffee before they head off to work because their workplace is 2 hours away? I don't know. So that's, when I think about vitality, I think about that. I think about communities that are full during the day, not just at night.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a lot you just laid out there. Because even trying to define what's rural and what's not, and there are different definitions by different people. The Office of Management and Budget, I think, says that it's any community that is 2,500 or less is rural, whereas the U.S. Census Bureau has a different definition. I might have it mixed up. And then the real definition that you find in any kind of dictionary says, well, more countryside. All right. So then you get into population density with academic research and what defines rural and what does not. In Vermont, we only have one metropolitan statistical area. That's Burlington and Franklin County up into St. Albans, and the rest of it is defined differently. So it's really fascinating to consider what is rural and not. I mean, the Northern Borders Regional Commission looks at all of Vermont as being considered eligible for their grants. So in that sense, for all of Vermont is rural, if you really take it to heart that way. But, I was at one of those coffee clashes in Lincoln, And it is a bunch of, town fathers that meet in the mornings and for coffee. And now with COVID, they bring their lawn chairs and they sit in the town parking area across from the general store. And they sit and they talk about the problems. And it was great to be among them and to really talk about issues that were important to them. And so I brought up things such as, what about gun safety? What about community? And it's great to get their perspectives. And same thing happens at the Tego store in Pomfret and in the fire station in South Woodstock. Although yesterday it was too cold for them to hang out, so they went inside and found coffee. So it does exist, but you're talking about a systemic issue and really captured in the book Bowling Alone by Putnam, talking about
nice call out there. I read that book a long time ago.
Yeah, and I've seen increasing references to it. I just picked up the book. I thought this would be a nice, easy read. Not quite so. Talking about social capital in the 400 and some odd pages of the book.
It's a really good book. Everyone should read it. It came out 30 years ago, maybe
20 years ago.
Yeah, it's a good one.
I was talking about the changes in the social fabric and social capital and what that means, and trying to identify the reasons behind why people are joining things less. And how do we measure that community health is, I think, where you're going in that sense. And when we started the Economic Development Commission in Woodstock, we were trying to figure out, all right, well, how are we going to measure if we're effective or not? Woodstock has 3,000 people. We're really rural in that sense. We have a concentrated village, but we're pretty rural. It's not like other rural communities in the sense that we have a very well-defined downtown. We've got some history. We've got some beautiful buildings, and there's a lot of second home communities that are helping it out. But so what do you measure? So for us, we were looking at, well, let's look at the number of full-time residents as a measurement of vitality. And it's really hard to do consistently. So what about we look at the number of registered voters and active participation? Let's look at the number of kids enrolled in our elementary school as being a measurement of vitality. Number of visitors. We look at the amount of gross receipts from our retail and commercial sectors to try to see, is there commerce going on? New business startups. Some things that we thought about is, they're difficult to measure. What percent of somebody's income are they spending on housing? In terms of what is the percentage of people living in poverty? So there's so many different measures. You can't use them all necessarily, but those are all indicators of, is a community vital or not? When I'm on my bike quite a bit and riding along the dirt roads, and you come across an abandoned house and you try to think, what happened here? What's the story? And I was in, I think it was Newfane or it was Wilmington. It was on a back road and looked like a great house. And I've talked to Maura Collins at Vermont Housing Finance Agency about this. Like, what about all these abandoned houses? She said, well, some of them really need to be torn down because they have been abandoned so long, you just can't do anything with them. But others, they can be rehabbed. And that's a part of the solution for our housing crisis. But there are cases of whole communities which just become abandoned. How do you stop that? And that's what I'm most interested in. I'm nervous about the number of empty storefronts in small communities. I was in Bennington yesterday, and Bennington has done a great job with the Putnam block, and there's some real good energy there, and there are some good things happening there. But there's still a lot of empty storefronts. So how do you fill those, and how do you make it so that your community is involved and engaged? Mm-hmm. So I look at that as some of the things that are going on. And one last thing, just thinking about dairy farms. We've had a 60% decline in the number of dairy farms, yet the number of cows or the amount of milk being produced is level or increasing. And so that means that there's just fewer operations, but they're bigger ones. And so what are all those farms doing that where there used to be cows on the side of the hill, or they used to be productive? And so you have to look at that diversity in agriculture and making sure that there is working lands as another way to make sure that those rural communities are keeping the character of Vermont, but people are actually earning a living in working in the land. And that's really vital, I think, to the success.
And that for me is, I think, the piece that we often leave out of our policy. It's that we are either trying to save something that once was, or trying to sort of create something from somewhere else. But the idea that that farm might be able to pivot into the future with something different, right? And we see that some places really, really well, but we haven't figured out how to sort of support it happening in the same way. Or someone doesn't want to join the Lions Club or the Rotary, or, you know, Charlie, you will soon be a man of a certain age. And I imagine you're not actually going to sit outside the gas station for a few hours every morning. And so what are the new places to gather? What is the new face of downtown that's not another tchotchke shop or hardware store, if that's not what people are purchasing? And so how do we really understand and invest in the communities that people really want to live in a thriving way, when very few of us can even imagine what that might be?
Mm-hmm. You know, I think you raise an interesting point, Emily, because I often find it a curiosity question for me when I hear us talk about policy, but also sort of some of our data gathering practices. And I sometimes feel like we go top down rather than bottom up. For example, when I hear conversations around workforce a lot, I hear a lot of folks talk about this business needs these type of skilled workers and this business needs these type of skilled workers. But I have yet, and maybe it's there and I haven't seen it, but I have yet to see a study that says, okay, let's look at X community. What skills already exist? And what do we bring to match those skills, rather than assuming that everyone needs to change their skills to meet a specific business. I'm not saying one approach is better than the other. It seems to me like the bottom up or the grassroots up approach is sometimes missing.
One thing that I've seen actually really interestingly in Brattleboro recently is that the community's really still been struggling with SIT shutting down its on-campus programs 5 years ago.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And there are a lot of folks who sort of worked in the nexus of the School for International Training. And so many of them have now stepped into different support roles with our new American Afghan community. But very few of those are paid jobs. But as that develops, as people sort of find their way, as some of the organizations that are supporting these folks become more formalized, there are sort of job opportunities there that really match the skill set that a lot of folks in our area have. And there are more ways we could do that in a more conscious way than we often do.
Good point.
Yeah, and Olga, to your point about bottom up, I mean, it's one of the programs that we launched last year in the legislature is called the Better Places Program. And the idea is really to have communities lead that process of really invigorating public spaces and using some crowdfunding and using some state dollars and guidance to help transform public spaces. That's happened in Brattleboro in some places. And that can happen in a lot of communities, but it's not to be top down, but to be really from the community. And I think about some of the rural areas and the diner that's closing in Quechee is a tough location. It hasn't been successful for any operator there.
Yes, that's also a thing.
Yeah, but then the question I think becomes, can a good operator or can someone with passion run a business that overcomes some of those obstacles? And the answer is yes. You know, the build it and they will come. Years ago, when I lived in St. Albans, my parents loved this particular restaurant in Montgomery, and it's called Zach's on the Rocks. Zach was a phenomenal entertainer, chef, and had this thriving business in the really the middle of nowhere. But it brought people there, and it was incredible. So, and you think about Hill Farmstead up in Greensboro as being this beer capital of the world because of the people that are so passionate about what they're doing in rural Vermont. So I think there's great examples of where someone with an idea that receives either the support of the community or they're just able to harness that energy on their own, they can make a significant difference. So we can't underestimate the ability of individuals to transform their own lives, but also the communities. So to your point, how can we support them? How can we support those transformational moments, those ideas in rural areas of the state? And I think we can to just capture people's imagination.
We have just a couple minutes before the end of this section, before we have to go to break. So just a time check, Emily. Sorry.
I just wanted to add that, I think, yes, we can capture people's imagination. I think we can also make the enabling environment for folks to sort of bring their ideas to fruition a lot clearer. A positive, strong regulatory framework makes a huge difference in terms of what, I think one thing that we see all the time in Vermont, we've talked about this before, Charlie, is that someone has an idea, they are an inventor, or they're very good at a particular thing. That doesn't mean that they're particularly good at business or particularly good at HR or particularly good at navigating environmental regs. And they don't necessarily need to be if they could find that information and that handholding somewhere in their community. And very often they can't. And I think that would be a fun thing to talk about after the break.
Fantastic. Thank you. So the Montpelier Happy Hour will return on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. So stay tuned. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you're just joining us, I am your host, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking with regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, as well as Lieutenant Governor candidate Charlie Kimball. So glad you can both be here. We have been talking about rural vitality and what it, in the first half of the show, we discussed even like how do we define vitality? How do we define rural? And, Emily, some of what you said made me really think that, in some ways, growing up in these small communities like I did. So I spent most of my childhood in the big population of Wilmington, which was huge compared to Whitingham. And then right over the line, I also have deep roots in Heath, Massachusetts, where my maternal grandparents had a farm and my paternal Meme and Pepe had a general store. And so I, as a child, figured I would grow up to either be a farmer or own a general store. Part of me still wants to own a general store. I loved I loved Peter's General Store. Anyway, and to me, it's so much what we're talking about. It's like something you feel, which does not help the conversation at all when we need to talk about policy. But yeah, this sense of community, I think, is what I have taken away from my years in these smaller towns. And I'm going to turn it over to Emily because the recycling truck's picking up outside.
And that's, we could talk about waste disposal in small towns. I think that's actually an interesting question. But before we do that, I just want to say that the views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests and not their employers, nor the radio station, nor TV station that those views and opinions might be broadcast through. So going back into the conversation about rural vitality, and right before the break, I brought up an idea that I don't remember anymore, but perhaps you remember it, Charlie, as sort of a conversation to continue into this one. Do you, by any chance, remember what it was that I was talking about?
No, I was so riveted on the next subject matter of coming up with a new cocktail using rural ingredients. I do not properly recall the specific question where you were going.
Okay.
Oh dear, we didn't have to get drunk to like forget our train of thought.
Oh.
No. You know what it was? I remember now. It's actually related to the garbage disposal. It's related to sort of like, what does it take in, a state with very few people, and some degree of sort of centralized population and government to really like meet people's government needs. So we were talking about sort of how to help small entrepreneurs or employees navigate getting their sort of legal and process needs met, right? Like, how do people learn how to get through environmental regs and be good human resources custodians, or be, employees who know their rights? And how do we do that in a way that people can like access real people? Or how do farmers get technical assistance down here in Southern Vermont, right? Where people can like talk to real people so that they feel like they're having real conversations and really know things, given that there aren't that many of us. And so it's sort of hard to like have a person for every person all throughout the state when there aren't that many of us in any part of the state. And so that's like, solving that problem feels really important to me. The more I talk to constituents who sort of are trying to pivot their businesses or trying to find a new career path, I find myself often saying like, yeah, I know this one person who does this here and you should talk to them, but really I know like 40 people and a whole agency in Burlington or Northampton that you should go talk to. And that's hard to sort of like send people out of community to solve their problems.
I think there's a couple of things. One, just in terms of leveraging the systems and the technology that we already have. And we can do a better job as a state. And we're certainly trying to move that way with establishing a single business portal for business owners or interested entrepreneurs to find the answers to the questions that they have, so they can access it online. It doesn't do everything, obviously, because you still need to get to a person when you're frustrated, you can't find what you want on that internet site. And we've all been there. It's like, I just have this one question. Can you answer it for me? So part of it is the information that we can make available to people searching for it. And I think we're moving in that direction pretty well with that single business portal. We worked on that in the legislature to try to make that easier. The second piece, in terms of like training available for technical assistance for farmers and for businesses, part of the new plan for the farm to plate next decade that was published last year was to really increase the number of people available to provide technical assistance for those folks in smaller agricultural enterprises. So that's definitely a plan. UVM does a pretty good job with extending its extension service. And also there's the farm and forest viability work that's been done through VHCB and also assisted by UVM. So there is that question. UVM would like to be that single door to call through its Office of Engagement.
Charlie, I know about all those different offices, but because of being on the Commerce Committee, but I can barely even keep them straight in my own head. I can't, in fact, like handing that to someone as like here's the suite of options for you.
We almost need like a 211, but for entrepreneurs.
Yeah. Well, and then locally, I mean, it's really the regional development corporations that should be providing that. And I think BDCC does a great job of connecting people to the resources they need. But even to get somebody that is in as an entrepreneur, who do you call? Do you call BDCC and they can point you to everybody? So I would hope that the Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation has enough of a name recognition and an establishment so that people would easily go to them. But you're right. There's so many different people that are involved, kind of the alphabet soup of organizations throughout the state. It can be confusing. So I'm not quite sure how to answer that because, like in workforce development, we're talking about all these different entities without really one clearinghouse to make sure that you know where to go. And so it can be confusing. And I just say that there is an interest and a desire to be more connected. We just have to work on that on a statewide level to make sure that we make that happen.
I think as someone who lives and works in Vermont, I don't really consider myself a true entrepreneur, but one thing I've always found interesting is, I usually have what I call my day job, which usually comes with very standard things like a W-2. And navigating my financial and regulatory life with a W-2 and that type of employment feels very easy in Vermont.
Yeah.
Where it gets tricky is when and I am sure I am not the only one, loops in my freelance work. Because I do freelance journalism and some marketing for some local organizations. And it's when that 1099 comes in, or all those other different ways that I build my work and my financial life, that things start getting really fuzzy.
And you don't do that just to like get your emotional needs met in your career. You do that so you can pay your rent.
Right.
Because your day job.
Yeah, you know that old joke, what do you call a Vermonter with only 3 jobs?
Part-time?
Lazy.
Yeah. Being self-employed is not easy. And anybody that says, oh, I'm just going to start a business. Well, there's a lot to it. And some people don't have the aptitude. They might, as Emily was saying before, some people have a particular skill, but not the business aptitude. And that becomes difficult. I represented artists as part of my work experience. And the artists, some of them were incredible business people, and some were horrible. And the ones who were willing to just focus on the art and then leave the business to somebody else that they trusted had a particular formula that worked. And the other business, some of the artists, like Warren Kimball, for instance, no relation, in Brandon, Vermont, incredibly successful, but he had a real head for business and promotion as well as his artwork, as did his wife. So that it made that successful. So it is difficult to be self-employed. And there are folks that are, to your point, who do I call? And so even within state government and outside of state government, it's who's willing to help. I found that in most cases, state government is very willing to help when you have a question on the call. Not always, but most of the time. And can you find that help locally? I think you can. And part of being self-employed is trying to find those resources. Someone opens a store and builds inventory. How do you buy? How do you buy inventory? That is hard, right? I mean, the general store is particularly, you're dealing with 100 different vendors. So how do you manage all those? Some people are really good at it, and they can do it like it's just natural to them, and others have a more difficult time. So I don't know the right answer to that, but that's part of the success of being, or part of being a successful business owner is being able to have either the not the natural ability, but the willingness to get the skills that you need in order to do that.
I agree with you, Charlie. I will just put a finer point on my comment, though, is I sometimes feel, as someone who's trying to combine different revenue streams, that some of the regulations that cover those different revenue streams are not working together.
Okay.
So, for example, I am very grateful. I now have a day job that provides health insurance.
Yeah.
So thank you, day job. But before that, I was going through the marketplace. And when you're a freelancer, your income does this throughout the year. Yeah. And even with a day job, my income did that. And there's this expectation that every month I would call the marketplace and say, oh, my income's changed, so change what I'm paying on my premium.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I don't think the state has time for that. I certainly, my head just kind of imploded. So that's what I mean by there's some regulations that just, I don't think support like what I would call non-traditional W-2 jobs.
One of the things that I think is really interesting about how we solve those problems sometimes is that for an employer or for a business at most of the systems are designed around annual income and your total annual income, and maybe measured in different ways. Like, is it AGI? Is it what, is it after withholdings, whatever it is. But that's sort of on the annual basis. And then, but for most sort of reasons you would talk about your income on the personal level, usually related to accessing some sort of state benefit, or even filling out financial information, say for, school lunches or your kids, your kid school figuring out their tax liability. All of that happens on the month-by-month basis, or even sometimes on the 2-week basis. And it's still built on this sort of assumption that every family has a single paycheck, which has probably never been true in Vermont, but isn't even true in most of America at this point. And it's really somehow at a higher income level, sort of the annual is trusted. But at a lower income level, there's sort of the need for the 2 weeks or the month. And it's hard for unemployment insurance. It's hard for accessing healthcare. It's hard sort of across the board. And it is like, it's never designed around this idea that we are sort of like complex people with complex lives and complex, streams of money coming in.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So making it simpler, I think, is what you're saying too. Simpler to administer. And then oftentimes you get into the discussion about, well, if you made it simpler, there's going to be some times in which you're paying too much or paying too little, but does it all even out in the end? Probably does, right? So how can you make that work? Interesting discussion. Yeah, whether it's rural or non-rural.
Right.
Yes, but I think one of the reasons that this is sort of particularly acute here is because it's sort of a long-standing Vermont tradition to have, because there is sort of no one thing that will work for most people. We are patching it together because resources tend to be spread thinner.
Yeah, I mean that joke about calling a Vermonter with only 3 jobs lazy, I always come back to that joke when I think of my working life, because in some ways it's not funny.
No, I don't think it's even a little bit funny.
But it symbolizes for me how deeply embedded in our culture this idea of patching it together and making it work, and that kind of baling twine and duct tape ethos. We even do it with we don't just do it with our farm tractors. We do it with our financial lives too, which is a whole host of problems in of itself. But like I said, I think it speaks to something that has been such a necessity for so long. It's become a tradition, and even one that we try to joke about.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I've had times where I've had 3 jobs as well, and including the legislature. And part of that is from my own doing. And I think a lot of us, I know this person who is in a position to have more responsibility working at her employer and chose not to because she wanted to have a different balance in her life. So it was a decision she made. And for me, it's also been decisions. I mean, I've had 4 different careers, and I'm not alone. I've talked to a couple of other people who've had the same type of thing, because it was, all right, I want to do something different now. Where I've always admired the people that could know that they were going to do the same thing for 35 years and retire. And that in Vermont, there seems to be that tradition of, well, let me change something up a little bit. And so some of it's of necessity, some of it's by choice. Would you agree with that?
That deep tradition I was talking about, I think it's more about necessity. I think you're right. I think there are people who are making choices about work-life balance, but particularly that tradition.
Yeah.
And that kind of long-standing tradition, I think, was more about necessity than choice, because there weren't always places where you could get a job for 40 years.
Right? Yeah.
And have a pension at the end of it,
Yeah.
I don't know. What's your thought, Emily?
I think there's by necessity. And then I think that for a lot of people, what looks like choice is also sort of part of necessity. Like, how long are you going to just wait tables? given all of the other ways that that impacts your life. And maybe you're going to sort of split up waiting tables with working part-time at the health department. But you can't actually work full-time at the health department because you need to pick up your kids from school at 3 o'clock. And that's not a lifestyle choice. It's that there's actually no after-school care at your school because of, rural Vermont schools can't provide all services at this particular point, or aren't providing all services. And so it looks like a choice to sort of pivot from one to the other, but it's the only choice that's sort of available to make life actually workable for folks while they enter different phases of their life. And so
false
when
choice.
we talk about, when we talk about rural vitality, we talk about sort of people coming together in those community centers. We talk about opportunities being available.